In the dim and grim shadows of the 14th century, the world was a place of relentless fear and superstition. Imagine a time when the sky was always dark, and the air thick with the stench of death and decay. The Black Death, a plague that swept through Europe like a grim reaper, had left corpses piled high in the streets. People were so terrified that they turned to anything that could offer them a glimmer of hope. In this bleak world, a group of people known as the Brethren of the Free Spirit emerged, preaching a radical form of Christianity that shook the very foundations of the Church. The Brethren of the Free Spirit were not your typical monks or nuns. They were a motley crew of clerks, students, and even wealthy women who had renounced their possessions and status to live a life of poverty and piety. They believed that true salvation could only be found by following the example of Jesus Christ, who had no wealth and lived among the poor. But their message was more than just a call to poverty. It was a challenge to the corrupt and lavish lifestyle of the Church. The Church, which owned vast amounts of land and wealth, saw these brethren as a threat to its power and authority. The Brethren's teachings were simple and radical. They believed that to be without property was to be without sin. They preached that the Church had strayed from its true purpose, which was to help people find a direct and personal connection with God, not to control and exploit them. This message resonated with many, especially those who were disillusioned with the Church's corruption. Women, in particular, were drawn to the Brethren's message. They found in it a way to escape the strict and oppressive roles that society had imposed on them. For many women, the Brethren offered a path to spiritual fulfillment and a sense of community that they had never known before. But the Church was not about to let this movement grow unchecked. The Brethren were labeled as heretics, and their leaders were hunted down and burned at the stake. One of the most famous of these leaders was Marguerite Porete, a woman who wrote a book called The Mirror of Free Souls. Her book was a passionate and poetic exploration of what it meant to be truly free in the eyes of God. For her efforts, she was excommunicated and burned along with her book in 1310. Despite the persecution, the Brethren continued to spread their message, and their influence persisted even after the Church had tried to silence them. While the Brethren sought a purer form of Christianity, others were turning to darker paths. In a world where fear and despair were constant companions, some people turned to sorcery and magic in the hopes of gaining control over their lives. The Church, which had always been wary of such practices, now saw them as an even greater threat. Sorcery was not just a form of heresy, it was seen as a pact with the devil himself. The Inquisition, the Church's arm of justice, began to hunt down and punish those who were accused of practicing magic. Women, in particular, were often the targets of these witch hunts. They were accused of using magic to harm others, often for reasons as trivial as a broken heart or a sick cow. The trials for sorcery were brutal. Accused individuals were tortured until they confessed to crimes they may not have committed. These confessions were often filled with lurid and fantastical details, which only served to fuel the fear and hysteria. The devil was portrayed as a grotesque figure with horns and cloven hooves, a being of pure evil that could be summoned through dark rituals. The stories spread like wildfire, and the fear of witches and sorcerers became a common thread in the fabric of medieval society. Despite the fear and persecution, some voices of reason emerged. Nicolas Oresme, a respected philosopher and mathematician, was one such voice. He argued that many of the so-called miracles and magical feats could be explained by natural causes. He suggested that the visions and hallucinations experienced by those accused of sorcery might be the result of mental illness or the use of drugs. Oresme's rational approach, however, was a rare exception in a world where superstition and fear often prevailed. The conflict between the Church and these heretical movements reached a boiling point in the late 14th century. In 1378, a new and more dangerous threat emerged from within the Church itself. The Papal Schism, a split within the Church, began when two popes were elected, each claiming to be the true leader of Christendom. This schism would have far-reaching consequences, leading to decades of conflict and division. The Papal Schism was sparked by the actions of Robert of Geneva, a cardinal who was sent to Italy to quell a rebellion against the Church. Robert was a ruthless and ambitious man, willing to use any means necessary to achieve his goals. When the people of Cesena, a town in Italy, resisted his control, he ordered a brutal massacre. The town was sacked, and thousands of people were killed, including women and children. The horror of this event shook the foundations of the Church and further eroded the trust that people had in its leaders. The Papal Schism and the violence it unleashed were a reflection of the larger issues that plagued medieval society. The Church, which was supposed to be a source of comfort and guidance, had become a symbol of corruption and oppression. The Brethren of the Free Spirit and others who sought a purer form of Christianity were a challenge to this corruption, but their efforts were met with violence and persecution. The fear of sorcery and witchcraft only added to the atmosphere of terror and division. In the end, the 14th century was a time of great turmoil and change. The world was a dark and frightening place, but it was also a time when people were beginning to question the authority of the Church and seek new ways of understanding their world. The stories of the Brethren of the Free Spirit, the witch hunts, and the Papal Schism are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the struggle for a better future. Despite the darkness, there were always those who dared to challenge the status quo and seek a path of truth and justice.